Greetings, and welcome back. We're having a little conversation, Peter, there about how we work with our legal clients, how we work with our legal people, pension lawyers, solicitors, in defending their client. And their client could be PI company, it could be an IFA, it could be the actual client themselves, it could be anybody that's involved in a pension advice case. Huge amount of respect for these guys and girls and people that are involved, the smart people that know the application of the law. And where I think we best sit, Peter, is in assessing the suitability of that financial planning advice in the context of the COBS rules that are set down by the FCA. And there are some particular elements of that suitability which I know you and me are quite keen on exploring when we get asked to look at a case.
That's right, John. And should we start off with objectives?
Let's start there. That's as good a place as any. What the hell are they doing getting advice in the first place?
Yeah, and I know when you give advice to clients, you ask them for a plan. Yeah. And that plan has to be realistic. It has to be specific. It has to be measurable, attainable, and time-lined. Yep. And I think there is a lack of specific objectives. We, on a regular basis, see tick boxes for objectives that are pre-printed objectives, or examples of generic, I want flexibility. What does that mean? And I know that if there was one thing that I would urge people to do out there is to obtain in greater detail the specific objectives that the client wishes to endure in their retirement. And that may be buying a new kitchen, put an extension on the house, deliberately get a date, a year, the amount that they are specific, so they could then demonstrate that they would require ad hoc or tax efficient withdrawals from the fund to be able to demonstrate that is why potentially that is a route to take as opposed to taking the DB benefit. That would be one aspect.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's an interesting one, because I love nothing better than a client who turns up with a spreadsheet and explains to me, here is all my income and expenditures. Here's when I'm intending to retire. This is how much income I need. This is my essential spending, my discretionary spending. I want to buy a new car. We've got a world cruise. This is for the kids. They're going to get married. And it's all laid out. And I think, wow, nothing better.
Absolutely.
Time, amounts, specifics, tax, etc., etc. That's manna from heaven when you're dealing with a client. But it comes back to this word, Peter, that I think is quite interesting in the context of us and our legal colleagues, if you like, our legal clients, evidence on the file.
That's right, John. And I think from that perspective, if we start off with the plan, as we would call it, on what the objectives are, you then move on to the requirements and the COBS, which are assessing suitability and assessing risk. So let's break that down, John, because I know this is a topic that is close to your heart. How do you assess risk?
Yeah, and we were talking about this earlier about, and not be careful here not to sound too arrogant about it, but I think assessing risk is relatively straightforward. But it's only relatively straightforward, obviously, if you understand how the risk assessment, and again, I'll point to COBS and I'll point to the FCA. In my opinion, and I think it's backed up by what we've seen in the cases that we've looked at from the FCA, risk is assessed on 3 different levels. It isn't sufficient enough to say they have a risk profile of X. Means nothing. I have an attitude to risk of 6 out of 10. Means nothing. The FCA, as defined within the COBS and the assessment of suitability, they're really looking for 3 aspects of risk. So they're looking for an IFA, an advisor, to have assessed an individual's attitude towards risk.
John, can I just ask a question there, okay? Because we've seen so many times where people have conflicting answers where a risk score comes out and there is no challenge in respect of or a query in respect of those answers.
And I think that's interesting, Peter, and I would take a fairly relaxed view on that as long as you were doing the next level, which is your appetite.
So you're now splitting the risk down into 3 different categories.
I'm splitting. So for me, if I go to, for example, say a legal chap, girl, business, firm contact and said, you have a look at this file. And I was looking at risk. And I was discussing it with you afterwards. The first thing I'd be saying to myself is, right, how have they assessed risk? I'm looking for 3 assessments under risk. So I'm looking for attitude.
So let's just clarify. Attitude is
the traditional.
Correct.
The traditional. I have got a piece of software where the client's filled in these questions and he's coming out 6 out of 10.
Okay.
Or medium, balanced, whatever he is.
So that's attitude.
That's attitude. Now, you brought up a very interesting question there, Peter, because if you look at attitude and within those questions there are some contradictory answers, if you're only using attitude, you would want evidence on the file of challenging those. However, what I would say is, what I would be looking for is the next level of assessment, which is appetite. So you would looking at a separate conversation around what appetite have you got for this amount of risk? Because it's telling me you're 6 out of 10, but 6 out of 10 means X. Do you have an appetite for that?
So let's just clarify that to the viewers. What we're saying is that a 6 out of 10 might mean that the equity content, growth asset content would be 60%. What we would do is to see what evidence there is on file that the IFA challenged into the client any contradictory answers they would have in terms of their appetite.
Yeah, or even assessing their appetite by saying, using your example, that 60% equity fund over the last 50 years could have lost at any particular point 40% of the value of the assets. Now, it's all very well the client saying I'm 6 out of 10. And then when you say, well, you could have lost 40% of your money at any point in time, you say, no way, I'm not having that. If I lost 40% of my 2 million, I'd be having canaries. I wouldn't be able to sleep.
So therefore, you would then not accept that their attitude was in line with their appetite and there might be a dial down.
Absolutely, Peter. This is, they're 3 separate measurements here. 3 separate measurements. There is the attitude. So I may well have a strong attitude towards risk, but actually my appetite for it is maybe not aligned with that. So let's dial that down, because it's one thing, Peter, as you've seen us doing and you've done yourself, when I say to a client, like, let's take your money and pretend it was in the markets in the last 50 years, and I'm going to tell you that at some point you would have lost 40% of that money, would you have rung me up?
And if the answer to that is yes,
Yeah.
you're not in the correct.
You're not 6 out of 10.
Absolutely. So how would you suggest our colleagues, financial planners, how would they evidence that, John?
Oh, that's a great question. That's another video when we talk about evidencing. Well, I think in a simple answer, it's very much like we are doing right now. This is not pretend. It's live. It's being recorded. It's a live conversation. We're discussing it. We're challenging each other. Why can't they do that with the clients?
Totally agree.
Now, bearing in mind, Peter, back in the day, pre-A-Day, videos would have been difficult. You would have been in those situations before yourself where to actually produce a 5-minute video would have taken about 3 days. But the technology's changed a little bit. That's not to say that there should not still be within the file some evidence of a risk conversation of some description.
But I think that's the great way of describing it. We don't see the evidence of the risk conversation. So
No.
we don't see somebody saying you came out at an attitude of a 6 out of 10, but on further investigation, the equity content, the volatility within that fund was too much for you to bear, and you, after discussion, preferred a lower equity content. That analysis, that explanation is not given in any file of these. So what we see is, well, you've come out to a score of 6, therefore you're a balanced investor, therefore the equity content is this, and that's it.
Yeah, no, it's very difficult. And in fact, I would even go so far as to say one of the things that gives me the creeps or makes, me nervous is when I see manually filled in attitude to risk questionnaires, and that's the only thing that's on the file. That it makes me nervous. But just to finish off our conversation, there is a third aspect to the risk as well, the risk assessment, and that is the capacity. So someone's going to an advisor to get advice, and the advisor is taking the data, saying, well, let me ask you these risk questions. How do you feel about risk? What's your appetite for this amount of potential change to your assets? And let me assess whether you've actually got the capacity for this. Capacity for loss, I think, was first mentioned by the FCA back in 2012-13, kind of timescales, Peter. So looking at cases post, let's say, definitely post 15, let's say, quite significant date, post 15. In cases post 15, you'd definitely be looking for a capacity for loss assessment, which is a totally different way of assessing risk, which is another conversation on another video.
See you in the next video.